If you're relying on real estate websites like realestate.com.au or domain.com.au or a host of other websites, well, you're not the only ones, because that's where the majority of Australian home buyers go to look for property. In this situation, you're competing with tons of other people often, and it means that you're going to have to compete and fight with competition. The best deals, often with less competition, a better price, and a unique opportunities, they're often sold under the radar in the process of an off-market deal. As a rentvestor, finding these deals can be really lucrative, and it can give you a serious edge when buying property. But I want to give you a bit of a warning, guys, because not all properties sold off market are good opportunities. In fact, there is a ton of junk that's overpriced, in poor condition, or not in a good location that's selling off the market. And these are the ones that you want to avoid. Often it's going to take sifting through a ton of junk to actually find a worthwhile deal that is worth considering. In this episode, I'm going to be pulling back the curtain on off-market properties. I've had my fair share of off-market purchases, and I'm going to give you the insider knowledge as to what actually makes an off-market property worthwhile buying. I'm going to tell you what you should definitely steer clear of. And in today's episode, I'm also at the end going to talk about how you also can get access to these deals. So stick around, because this could potentially help you find your next opportunity. I'm Steve Williams, and on this podcast, we talk about rentvesting, property, and getting ahead. I'm a rentvestor myself, and I'm also a licensed buyer's agent, and I've helped lots of people get their foot into the market, buying across the country. And I've also had my fair share of off-market deals, some of which I'm going to talk about in today's episode. But before we get started, I want to tell you that I have this quiz. And if you're wanting to understand where you're at in your property journey, maybe you're just a beginner and you want to see what you specifically need to do to start getting ahead, well, click the link below. It's going to take you to a 2-minute quiz, which is going to give you a score. So feel free to check that one out. In today's episode, we're going to uncover what exactly is an off-market deal, and also what is not an off-market deal. We're going to talk about why would a seller actually sell a property off-market? Why does that make sense? And then finally, I'm going to tell you how you can also get access to off-market deals. And these are tried and tested ways that I've used myself and for my clients. So let's jump into it. And we're going to firstly talk about what is an off-market property. Well, typically on the market means that firstly, it's for sale. It might be listed on real estate websites. Maybe there's a sign out the front, there's open homes, and all of these activities designed to market the property to attract as many potential buyers as possible. And for many sellers in a lot of markets, this is often a great way to sell, because the more competition there is, generally the higher price that they're going to achieve for the property. Things that off the market, typically they can either come directly from a seller. Maybe a seller doesn't want to use a sales agent, or maybe they're selling to someone they know and they don't feel the need to have a sales agent. So they just put in place a conveyancer, a solicitor, or a settlement agent, depending on what state you're in, to help manage that transaction. That is really a true off market. You can also get them through sales agents. Essentially, sales agents have a listing agreement with the seller, and it then enables them to sell that property on the seller's behalf. Some sellers sometimes choose to sell their property off market, or they may also have a number of reasons as to why they want to sell their property off market. I'm going to run through those in just a minute. But what are the advantages of buying a property off the market? Well, I've bought properties on the market, off the market. Definitely on the market, if you're considering on and off, you're going to get access to more opportunities, because most good quality properties would be really in the seller's interest to put it on the market. So what's the actual benefits of buying a property off the market? Well, let's talk about it from the buyer's perspective. Well, first things first, it means you're generally going to have less competition. It doesn't mean to say you're going to have no competition. In fact, when it's off market, it can still be distributed to people and a range of people who are going to inspect the property and potentially make an offer. So that's really the main benefit, is less competition means you can have a greater chance of securing the property. The other advantage is sometimes the deals we can get off the market can be really far superior to something that's on the market. And this could be for the reasons which I'm going to talk to you about in a second as to why the seller is selling it. Every situation is going to be different. Sometimes the sellers are really wanting to push for the highest price possible, which makes sense, right, if you're selling one of your own assets. But sometimes they are more like, look, I just need to offload this property. I need to sell it in a rush. And if we can get a deal done as soon as possible, or if the conditions meeting my requirements, then we're happy to sign the deal. And really the big advantage of off market, it just gives you access to more opportunities. So if we're looking on the market and off the market, we're just going to have a greater choice as to what we can choose when we're looking for a property. Okay, so what is not an off-market property? Well, I was driving around the suburbs the other day and there was literally a sign out the front saying, this property is for sale off the market. Well, it's not really off the market if there's a sign out the front saying that it's off the market, because that means that it's publicly being advertised and therefore it's starting to drum up that interest. If it appears on any of the websites, then that's also not off the market. So a true off market means that either it's direct from a seller or it could have a listing agent and there's essentially no marketing being done on the property. Maybe it's being sent out to buyer's agents, maybe buyers who missed out on another property that the seller has been working with, then maybe they are offering it to them. Or maybe you've even approached a seller and you've knocked on the door and just said, hey, I want to buy your property. And they've said yes. These are really the true off-market properties. Okay, Steve, so if there's advantages for the buyer, then why would a seller actually opt to sell off the market if they can sell it on the market and get way more money? Well, this is why. Firstly, there could be privacy reasons. You know, sometimes people, they're going through a little bit of a hard time and they don't really want to sign out the front. Maybe it's a divorce, or maybe there's been personal circumstances that don't want the whole neighborhood to be prying on their personal life to see what's going on. So rather than having it out there in the public, they choose to sell it off market for their privacy. I've seen this as well, where sometimes people can't actually afford the marketing costs. And when you're listing it with a sales agent, you do actually need to pay the marketing costs up front. Sometimes this can be anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000, including all your photography, your websites, etc. So if you want to actually avoid paying that, and if you can't afford it, then sometimes selling off market is a way to get your property sold without forking out all of these upfront costs. Another reason why might be that there's tenants in place. Maybe the tenants are really great and they're open to letting people through their home to inspect it. Or maybe the tenants are thinking, oh, I don't really want open homes done, and they're making it a little bit difficult for the sales agent, understandably, because it is their home. Or maybe the lease is quite a long lease and there's a fair bit to go. So this type of property is not going to appeal to an owner-occupier or someone who's wanting to live in it from day one, and they're trying to sell it to an investor and have a very, targeted person who they want to sell it to. In that case, the sales agent might opt and recommend to the seller that they sell their property off market. And then the other reason might be that they're just needing to sell it quickly. Maybe they have personal circumstances, they've had a financial situation come up, or they just need to get out of there and they're listing their home to get an urgent sale done. Because often if you're putting it on the market, there's time to get your photos done, your marketing done, your open homes done. All of that takes time. But if you need to get the deal done nice and quick, then maybe they could sell it off the market if there's a buyer out there that the selling agent can find nice and easily for them. And this is the final one, benefit for the sellers. Often I see that it's a case of they're just testing the waters. Maybe they're like, oh, look, my property's worth $860,000, but if I can get $900,000, yeah, I'll happily let it go. And I've seen this a lot when we get off market opportunities. Sometimes the prices are a little bit inflated and the properties literally aren't worth that. Maybe they might be in 6 to 12 months, but they certainly aren't right now. And that's a big watch out. Just because you might get an off-market deal doesn't mean it's a good deal. You really have to do your comparative market analysis and work out, what is this property actually worth? Okay, so far we've talked about what is an off-market property and why would a buyer choose to buy off-market, but also why would a seller choose to sell off the market. Now we've got that understanding, I want to talk to you about how do you actually get access to these deals. There's a range of options. As I said, when you're buying off market, sometimes there's a sales agent involved, sometimes there's not. Either way, there's pros and cons to both of them. From my experience in buying properties off market, when we buy directly from sellers, often it can actually be more complicated because sometimes sellers are a little bit unreasonable with the prices they want, or maybe they don't know the process and they don't really have anyone guiding them on the journey. And as someone has bought directly from sellers, there's often a lot of negotiation involved, and I guess trying to bring people down to make their price a little bit more realistic. That can be a little bit of a challenge. And that's something that selling agents often face in their job day to day, is obviously keeping their clients happy and getting the best price possible, but also being realistic in where the market is at. So that's one of the challenges sometimes we face in buying directly from sellers. And then, as I said, you can also get them through real estate agent contacts. Of course, if you use a buyer's agent, they can also uncover these opportunities for you as well. In these situations, when there's someone representing the seller and also potentially someone representing the buyer, it can make the transaction a little bit more seamless because you've got people managing the expectations of both parties and being able to negotiate the deal in a manner which is going to get the deal done. Okay, with these two ways of buying an off-market property known, how do you actually get access to these deals? Well, firstly, let's talk about if you're buying directly from a seller. Maybe like it's a friend or a family member. Maybe you go and knock on their door and say, hey, you want to buy your house? Or maybe you do a letterbox drop and you drop out a letter to all the houses in an area or a suburb. These are ways you can buy directly from a seller. And obviously, it's a case of being in the right place at the right time. I mean, I've worked for clients before and we've done letterbox drop. We've put 300-400 letters into the whole neighborhood, and maybe we only got 2 calls out of it. One property was suitable, but in this situation, the property, the sellers actually wanted a price which was a little bit higher than what we were willing to pay for this particular property. So if you are approaching people, obviously it's about expressing your interest and saying, hey, I want to buy this property. And then you go through a process of negotiation to get the deal done. Now, I'm going to have another episode come up where I talk about negotiation and how do you actually get a deal done. But it can be a little bit of a process, and sometimes it takes a lot of patience. And I mean, I've heard stories before of when someone has expressed interest in buying a property and it's actually taken years for someone to actually decide to say yes because their circumstances change. They're like, all right, it's time to move on from this property. Another thing you can also look at from a data perspective is if you're buying in a tightly held suburb. So that example I gave before with those 400 letterbox drops, it was in a very tightly held location. On average, people stay with their property for 11 years. Whereas other suburbs, sometimes the turnover is like 5 to 7 years. So there's a lot more properties coming up for sale more frequently. In that case, doing that approach could actually be a little bit easier because the chance of having someone that's just about to sell is going to be, I guess, statistically more possible. And now what if you're dealing with a real estate agent? They often say real estate agents are the gatekeeper to property, and I 100% agree. We only represent buyers, we don't represent sellers in our day-to-day, but I know that a big part of our job is getting to know sales agents, speaking to them all the time, finding out what properties are coming up, and also understanding what their sellers need. And that's part of the negotiation, right? Is because, as I said, we've understood why a seller might sell a property off market, but how can we align the needs of the seller with the needs of the buyer? An example might be that in a really tight market, so for example, in Perth, where houses were selling super quick in like 6 to 12 days, whereas the time to buy a house, it's a lot more challenging. There was a lot of people that were wanting to sell, but they were really fearful that they might not be able to buy something. What they decided to do was list with a sales agent and then sell the property off market and actually have a bit of a lease back, meaning that they could lease the property back from the new buyer to allow them time to then go and find somewhere to live. And this meant that there was a win-win. There was a winning for the seller, but also the buyer, if that suited their circumstances, and they could then negotiate a price and also a rental amount accordingly. So if you're wanting to access these deals from real estate agents, as I said, it's sometimes a case of being in the right place at the right time. Often it involves making lots of phone calls, maybe going to open homes, asking about them. Now, I just want to let you know this. Sometimes some agents, they don't like the concept of off-market properties. They have a strong feeling that all properties should go to the market. And in some markets and suburbs, I would certainly agree with that often it's better to go to market to drum up as much competition as possible. Maybe you might even consider an auction format sale, which therefore requires going on the market. So what I'm saying is if you're speaking to agents, just, I guess, tread lightly, get to know them, ask them the question. But if they say, look, we don't do that, totally fine. But just let it be known that it's just about going to the next agent or finding out who they are and getting access to these opportunities. So once you actually get an opportunity, like you might be told it, you might get a phone call or maybe even an email, and it's like, hey, I've got this opportunity. It's a 3x1. It's located in this suburb. It's 500 square meters of land. It already has a tenant in place, or maybe it doesn't, or this or this or this. And then essentially you want to start your due diligence process, and check out our other podcast episodes to learn about the things that you should do step by step. But I'll just say that just because it's off market doesn't mean that it's a good deal. You really want to do your due diligence, do your comparative market analysis, and understand, is the price worth it? And does the condition suit what I need in the sale? And also, is the property stacking up? Because sometimes you'll find that it isn't. And I'll say that we sift through a lot of properties before we find a good deal. And I'd say probably 70 to 90 properties we get access to before we find one that firstly is worth buying, and also that meets the briefs of our buyers. And most importantly, always just give feedback to the agents. You know, they're hardworking. You don't want to lead them on and say, yeah, sounds good. You want to say, hey, look, that doesn't quite suit what I need, because sometimes they can get a little bit excited if you're giving the indications that you might be a potential offer. So always take the time to give them a bit of feedback and say, hey, not for me, but thank you very much. And you never know, because the next one might be the right one for you. And this all sounds like a lot of work. And if you are wanting to shortcut this process, maybe consider a buyer's agent, because this is basically what we do on a day-to-day basis. The other thing as well, you may come across a lot of Facebook groups which publicize these off-market properties. Now, it's a good way, of course, sharing information, but in my opinion, when a property lands there, it's going to be seen by lots of other people. There's going to be tons of people looking at it, and potentially it's a case of the seller is being unrealistic, or there may be, 10, 20 other people that see that post and are also interested. So therefore, it's going to be quite competitive. So really, I don't really see that as a real off market. A real off market is when it's not published. Maybe it just comes hot off the press from the seller or the selling agent. Because once it hits Facebook, any social medias, or even through email distributions, you're already going to be facing competition, and it's going to be a lot harder to acquire that property. But in a nutshell, would I buy off market? Yes, I absolutely would. Some of the best deals that we've got for our clients have been off the market. In fact, myself, I purchased 2 properties about 6 months ago. Both property deals were done off the market, and each of the sellers had different requirements and conditions, but that worked for me in my purchase. So I made the purchase knowing that I was getting a decent price for the property and the conditions were favorable. Having said that, I think sometimes it's definitely worth looking on the market as well, because even though it's on the market, depending on the circumstances, you can sometimes get really great deals on the market as well. It's often a case, again, of being in the right place at the right time. I've had situations before where the weather turned bad and people decided to not go out for the weekend, or maybe there was a big event in the city and people were distracted, or maybe it was even a public holiday and people just weren't out looking at houses, and therefore you have a little bit less competition and you can get the deal done and buy a property. Sometimes those deals are often the best as well. But in a nutshell, today we've talked about what off-market properties are, why would a seller do it, why would a buyer buy off-market, and what is a true off-market, and also how can you uncover off-market properties. I'd love to get your thoughts if you've secured a property off the market, or if you've got any questions about the process of buying off the market. Pop it into the comments below. Happy to help you with any questions you've got. Guys, it's been great having you here as always. Remember to subscribe to the channel so you can get notified of the next episodes coming up. And until next time, let's Rentvest and get ahead together. All information contained in this podcast is general in nature and does not consider your individual circumstances. You should consider the appropriateness of this information with regards to your individual objectives, financial situation, and needs, and speak to a professional.